Baphomet is one of the most well-known esoteric images, having the power to both fascinate and frighten those of whom view it. And yet, despite the popularity of this image, very few ever speak of its origin, its creator, and its true message. In fact, out of all occult symbols, this is the one most prone to mislead, to invoke outbursts of passion and hysteria, even hatred. So then, what truly is Baphomet? Who created this most powerful image? And what does it really mean? The first recorded mention of the word Baphomet comes from the writings of a Frankish nobleman known as Anselm of Ribmont, of whom in 1098 stated in a letter that the Turks, during the siege of Antioch in the First Crusade, called loudly upon Baphomet, and we prayed silently in our hearts to God. What could this mean? The Turks, after all, are Muslims, the majority following the Sunni faith, and no such entity exists in either Turkish or Islamic sources. However, similar names do appear in later texts of which might throw light on this rather enigmatic name, such as those by Crusades chronicler Raymond of Aguilas, of whom notes that the troubadours, composers and performers of lyric poetry, used the term Baphomeria when referring to a mosque, and along with it, Baphomet for the Prophet Muhammad. Even later sources show something similar. A poem from around 1250 by Astorg de Orlach, for example, once again uses the name Baphomet to refer to Muhammad when describing a defeat during the Crusades. And it even appears in the translation of texts into the Occitan language, such as with Ramon Llull's work, Doctrina Puerile, the Doctrine for Children, where a chapter on Islam once again refers to the Prophet Muhammad as the name Baphomet. What is clear from these early fragmented, scattered texts is that somehow the name Muhammad had become corrupted through the Occitan language to become Baphomet. And thus, when Ribmont stated that he saw the Turks calling loudly upon Baphomet, it should be clear that he was truly referring to their calls unto Muhammad, the prophet of Islam and the central figure of the Sunni faith that the Turks belonged to. Despite this clarity as to the meaning of this corrupted term, however, it seems this name did not escape misunderstanding, becoming by the reign of King Philip of France associated with the Knights Templars, and even, for a time at least, believed to be an actual deity of which was worshipped by them. In fact, in 1307, when members of the Knights Templar were accused of heresy and subjected to Inquisition, the name Baphomet appears yet again in the surviving records, wherein Templars were accused of all matter of heinous and heretical acts: spitting on the cross, homosexuality, sodomy, and denying the Christ, to name but a few. Amongst these accusations, it was claimed that members of the Templars worshipped an idol known as Baphomet, of whose description changed from confession to confession, some describing an effigy of a human head with a beard, others suggesting that it looked more like a cat, or had 3 faces, or even that it was a real human skull, possibly that of Hugh de Payens, the first Grand Master of the Knights Templars. Others, however, denied all knowledge of such an idol, And indeed, as noted by Templar scholar Karen Rolls in her Knights Templar Encyclopedia, absolutely no record exists outside of the Inquisition for any deity known as Baphomet, either in the Templar rolls nor in the wider body of medieval documents relating to the Knights. What is also clear here is that the accusations themselves, bizarre as they might sound, were not directed at the Knights Templars alone. Exactly the same spurious charges, like spitting on the cross, were levied against the Cathars and even the kidnapped Pope, Boniface VIII. What seems obvious here is that any accusation of heresy was going to be used and exaggerated against those interrogated during the Inquisition. For this reason, when the Templars either incorporated Islamic doctrine into their belief system, or were otherwise accused of communing, reading, or having any knowledge at all of Islam, a religion believed in itself to be idolatrous, they would, by extension, be accused of worshipping its deities and prophet, of which, through the corruption and mistranslation of names, would mean they were worshipping Muhammad, or rather, Baphomet. In the 19th century, Josef Freiherr von Hammer-Purgstall wrote an essay with the suitably long title Discovery of the Mystery of Baphomet, by which the Knights Templars, like the Gnostics and Ophites, are convicted of apostasy, of idolatry, and of moral impurity by their own monuments. This mouthful of a work was essentially a thinly veiled attack on the Knights Templar history, and by extension the workings and beliefs of Freemasonry, of which the author had wished, from his very first penstroke, merely to discredit. In what amounted to little more than historical fiction, Hammer-Purgstall attempted to accuse the Templars of worshipping a deity called Baphomet, citing stone figurines with the name had been unearthed by archaeologists. These figures, the author said, were hermaphrodites with 2 faces and beards, surrounded by suns and moons, serpents, and other strange emblems. These idols, he claimed, the Templars carried around in their coffers, and may have been worshipped and associated with obscene sexual rites. This work did not pass unchallenged, however, and indeed these stone figurines were regarded from the start as either elaborate forgeries or, in the words of Victorian writer Charles William King, the paraphernalia of alchemical quacks. That said, some European museums did indeed display pseudo-artifacts of such a nature, many of which were originally categorized under the name Baphomets. Although some of these figures may have been mistranslated Egyptian artifacts, most were certainly forgeries, with symbols and themes bearing no relation whatsoever to any known belief systems, including those practiced by the Knights Templar. No such deity was ever worshipped, scholars agreed, and no image of Baphomet existed. That was, of course, until 1856, when the second volume of the Dogmas and Rituals of High Magic was published. This book, written by the French esotericist Eliphas Levi, included as its frontispiece an image of which he had drawn himself. It was called Baphomet, and is of course the famous image of which we all recognise today. Before looking into what this image means, however, it is worth looking at the wider context of who Eliphas Levi was, and what inspirations and sources he drew from when compiling his famous book, and by extension, creating his image of Baphomet. Eliphas Levi was born in 1810, and had originally pursued a career in the Catholic Church, before he abandoned the practice in his 20s to instead become a ceremonial magician. He was also a radical socialist, declaring himself a representative of a true form of the Catholic Church, something different from what he viewed as a corrupted religion led by Rome and the wider Church. His Catholicism, he declared, was aligned not only with the truth of the mysteries of Christ, but of a true form of socialism as well. By the 1850s, however, his views had somewhat changed, and he began to incorporate occult practices into this form of true Catholicism, now claiming that these elaborate mysteries reached back once again to the Knights Templars and to the ancient school of Alexandria, wherein it was believed a separation between true and false religion took place. Whatever their real origins, the magical works propagated by Levi were of great interest, free from fanaticism, and compiled by a man of whom, as he described himself, was a poor and obscure scholar who has found the lever of Archimedes, and he offers it to you for the good of humanity alone, asking nothing whatsoever in exchange. His theories were mainly concerned with astral light, the power of the will, and imagination as a magical agent. Of course, Levi did not discover nor originate any of these ideas, and thus the compilation and explanation of such topics could be quite a difficult task. It can sometimes help, therefore, for symbols and signs to be created in order to communicate a concept or idea, rather than try to explain it in complicated words and phrases. This is the basis of the pictogram and ideogram, a type of symbol which represents an idea or concept without the need for, and thus becoming independent of, language. In its most simple form, it is a drawn graphical depiction of what the concept represents, and forms the basis of much ancient proto-writing systems. If a culture or tribe knows what a symbol means, such as a fish or a fire, it can be instantly communicated between them, without any need to explain or complicate the matter. The same is true for Baphomet, and when Levi drew this image, he was attempting to create a symbol to illustrate a central pillar in the body of occult practice, known sometimes as the aim of Hermeticism, the Great Work. It is a concept of which is to be found in almost all esoteric literature, and without which much of the material would fail to make sense. Levi himself described it as the following, abbreviated for the purposes of the documentary. There exists in nature a force of which is more powerful than steam. This force was known to the ancients. It consists of a universal agent whose supreme law is equilibrium, and whose direction is concerned with transcendental magic. This agent is exactly what the adepts of the Middle Ages called the first matter of the Great Work. The Gnostics represented it as the fiery body of the Holy Spirit, and it was the object of adoration in the secret rites of the Sabbath of the Temple, under the hieroglyphic figure of Baphomet, or the androgynous goat of Mendes. In other words, Levi's Baphomet is an invented symbol of which, to those well versed in esoteric literature, communicates instantly the properties of this mysterious force, of which it is claimed, when understood, can help us to understand something about the universe itself, and with it, something about ourselves. So, what does it all mean? Levi described the force of which Baphomet represents as the supreme law of equilibrium, a concept sometimes described as above, so below, the central theme in the story of the tarot, as well as other mystical and esoteric works. It was likely something observed by our earliest ancestors, and is indeed something evident to us all from our first days on earth. Baphomet shows this sign with his arms, the same sign displayed by the magician card in the tarot. It is a depiction of this concept of as above, so below, a phrase first noted in the emerald tablet and described as merely that which is above is like to that which is below, and that which is below is like to that which is above. In other words, what is true for the universe is true for mankind, and what is within the universe is within mankind. So learn something about one, and you have learnt it about the other by extension. The universe and us are thus like a mirror, just as these signs of occultism appear almost like a reflection of themselves. And so just as we are born from a union of male and female, beginning as a tiny cell with the potential of life within it, and growing gradually into who we are today, so too might have the universe, coming into being from a union or singularity, the potential of all life and forms within it, growing, expanding outwards into the shapes, planets and solar systems of which we know and observe. First comes unity, and then division. Indeed, the sun and moon were likely some of the earliest forms of this duality that our ancestors observed, and have long been regarded as deities and symbols of this male and female equilibrium. And so Baphomet's hands are pointing towards two moons. These were described by Levi as the white moon of Chesed and the black moon of Geberah. Here we must examine the Tree of Life, another symbol, this time from the Jewish Kabbalah, a symbol said to represent the entirety of that expanding universe, depicted as 10 spheres or Sephiroth, and joined by various paths representing the all that is. Geberah, the fifth of these Sephiroth, and the black moon on Baphomet, represents the essence of judgment and limitation, whereas Chesed, the fourth Sephiroth, and the white moon, is loving kindness and mercy. And so here again are two opposing forces, and yet when brought together they can result in another act of creation. These forces are often associated with our hands, just like with Baphomet, and so we might imagine a woodcarver, holding wood in place with one hand, and chiselling away at it with the other. The balance of strength and support come together to result in the finished creation. The act itself a perfect harmony. The more force used by the chisel, the more force needed to hold the wood firmly in place. We can see this even further expanded by the words written on Baphomet's arms. On the arm pointing above, we can see Solve, and on the arm pointing below, Coagula. These phrases mean dissolving and coagulating, part of the principles of alchemy and concerned with the act of creation itself. That woodcarver of whom wants to make a chair has to imagine it in his mind first. It begins as a pure thought, long before the wood is even cut from the tree. He then needs to put his thought into action, to cut the wood and craft it using the aforementioned balance of forces, coming together into the shape he desires it to be, the shape he imagined as a thought to begin with. And so something is broken down into its basic elements and then brought back together into the form of something new. This may be like a mirror of creation itself, an endless dissolving and rebuilding of the elements that make up our universe, be they the creations and forms and shapes from the things around us, or like that mysterious singularity where everything comes together again to be reformed and made into something new, dissolved and coagulated. This universal balance can also be seen most especially with the flame erupting from the head of Baphomet, of which represents the equilibrium of matter and spirit, the soul elevated above the confines of the flesh, and yet still attached to it via the image of the candlestick. That soul or spark of life itself is the pentagram beneath the flame, shown in the centre of the forehead near to the ajna or third eye chakra. Here are all of the elements that make up the universe, the 4 carnal ones at the bottom, and spirit at the top, therefore showing that, just like before, what is true for the macrocosm, the universe, is also true for the microcosm, mankind. We contain within us an image or reflection of the whole, just like how a hologram cut into pieces would each contain the full image from its own perspective, instead of merely a part of it, like one might expect. The flame may also represent something known as the Kundalini awakening, a bursting forth of this potential spiritual force resulting in enlightenment, or a new way of seeing and understanding the universe. It is shown in ancient Hindu images as the serpent goddess of the same name, Kundalini, of whom may rise up the chakras from the root, also mirrored as Malkuth on the Tree of Life, the physical world of the mortal body, eventually bursting forth from the crown in this powerful moment, of which could be Kether on the Tree of Life, the pure light of spirit itself, of which some might call God, without which none of the other spheres of existence could ever truly exist. This Kundalini may also be seen on the phallus of Baphomet, of which here is not so much a true phallus as a caduceus, the serpentine image appearing to rise up and rest here at the centre of the image, so that if we imagine Baphomet superimposed over the Tree of Life, the torch of spiritual light would be Kether at the top, and the resting point of these serpents would be Tifereth, the central point on the Tree of Life, wherein all the other spheres flow into and cross through, and thus representing another perfect balance and equilibrium, and thus the centre of this cycle of all existence, the point of singularity, and thus of rebirth, positioned here as a potent, fertile force, an image of which, if translated to our own bodies, may suggest a seed with the power to impregnate and thus create new life. And yet, of course, Baphomet is neither human, nor is it fully beast. According to Levi, the goat's head represents the horror of the sinner, and yet it is also a humanoid image, hermaphroditic, with the breasts of which are said to represent humanity and the nurturing of our race, and the Kundalini-esque phallus showing their opposing force. The arms are both male and female, and it is covered with scales, and yet also the feathers and wings of a bird. And so with this awakening of which may befall us due to a perfect harmony and balance of forces, we may see that we are both finite and infinite, animal and spiritual, that we die and yet are also reborn, like the turning of the wheel seen on the image, suggesting an eternal cycle. It may have been inspired by proto-deities like Cernunnos, Pan, the horned gods of the wilds that our ancestors might have understood as part of themselves, that they are both remarkably similar to, and yet distinctly different from, the beasts of the fields, creating yet another sense of duality. Here we are able to expose the flaws in certain spiritual doctrines, gurus asking us to lose our egos or cast aside our physical belongings. Since those things make up part of the balance of our existence, to cast them aside entirely is not to live in some utopia of bliss like they might suggest, but to lose something of which makes us human and alive in the first place. Baphomet is an image of perfect balance, and thus represents that as above, so below, perfectly, in a single image, a pictorial depiction of the aim of Hermeticism, and the steps to be taken in order to achieve that awakening and understanding, of which sits at its centre. There is one more mystery regarding this powerful force of which Baphomet represents. We are, after all, able to actually observe the duality and equilibrium of energies in the world around us, if we only look for them. But what about this light of the flame, the spiritual power of enlightenment, even God itself? Are we able to see that too? Or to sense it in the world around us, and if so, what form does it take? According to famous occultist Aleister Crowley, Baphomet is not just a symbol of duality, but represents a hieroglyph of what he calls arcane perfection. In fact, Crowley was to use this symbol and its name in much of his own works, including the Creed of the Gnostic Catholic Church, thus returning the image to some of the early thoughts of its creator, as well as his works on magical theory and occult practices. For Crowley, of whom studied and expanded upon these theories throughout much of his life, the symbol was multifaceted in its meaning, suggesting on one level a very physical reality, the hermaphroditic figure being none other than the aforementioned sperm and egg, the light or life force thus being the creation of a new life through that sexual union of male and female. And yet, there is more to this as well. Crowley may have shown something of Baphomet in his version of the Tarot Devil in the Thoth deck. The caduceus here is just like Baphomet, and when this and the lower spheres are viewed together, they appear to clearly show the phallic nature of the image, each sphere containing within it seeds, or souls, waiting to be incarnated, ready to be reborn into a new existence, wishing once again to taste of life and its many pleasures, represented here as the goat's head once again. To incarnate, to live, is, after all, to rejoice in the wonders of the world, eating, drinking, making merry, like the ghost of Christmas Present from the famous story A Christmas Carol, and his inspirations in deities like Bacchus. We can even see on the Thoth card echoes of our chromosomes and DNA, the very blueprints of life itself, of which may also be reflected in the spiraling galaxies of universal cycles, blueprints of all types of life and experience, and mirrored here as the spiraling of the horns on the goat. These souls, however, desire something more than mere carnal pleasure, as, after all, this card, and also Baphomet, do not encourage the reckless abandon of hedonism, but rather the equilibrium of life, crowned by the spiritual light of the universe, of which enlightens the figure and makes it aware of its duality, and that as carrying the image of God within it, it is more than merely physical and base. So then, what is this light, really? How do we know when we have found it? When these souls incarnate, they are free to act out their wills and intentions, to use these practices of solve and coagula to make shapes out of matter, like the woodcarver and the chair. They are free to act however they please. Even if their actions will harm them, the choice and consequence are theirs alone. But then, which way should they go? Is there a right way, after all? And if they are wishing to achieve this enlightenment of Hermeticism, how would they go about it? Crowley speaks of this in his famously misquoted doctrine, the law of Thelema. Do as thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will. Which is to say, the underlying nature of will, its true purpose and meaning, is love. After all, the numerical values of the words Thelema, will, and agape, love, are both the same, adding up to the number 93. When will is therefore aligned perfectly with love, we become aligned with our true purpose. Our life's pursuits no longer merely in search of physical pleasure or joy, but of love itself, of which is now understood to be the true nature of that spiritual light, flowing into the heart of the universe, where the location of the seed of life is to be found in Baphomet, the beating heart of the cosmos, and Tifereth on the tree of life. If this is all a bit too much, we can find it in much simpler terms in the Bible. God is love, which is to say, God is literally love, not a person or a judge or a man in the sky, but the essence of love itself. And when you follow love, you become aligned with its power, of which will guide you in subtle and strange ways to your true purpose of incarnation, known in Thelema as one's true will. On the Thoth Devil card, the phallus appears to penetrate a ring of Saturn, of which at first glance is an obvious image of this physical unity, the sexual act. And yet, these rings, of which are the feminine counterpart of the masculine image, are also associated with Binah, the Great Mother, and by extension, into Crowley's magical workings, the goddess Nuit of Egyptian cosmology. Nuit carries the stars in her hair, and she is a goddess of the great cosmos and that endless rebirth that we see in Baphomet, such as when she swallows the sun at the end of the day and gives birth to it anew in the morning. In Crowley's famous work, The Book of the Law, we read from Nuit's perspective about the universe, its dualism and equilibrium, and referring on one hand to her separation from her partner, Geb, the earth god, and also the nature of the universe itself. I am divided for love's sake and for the chance of union, she says. This is the creation of the world. And here is the true message of this image, as spoken by the goddess in this infamous work. Baphomet reminds us that what is true for us is true for the universe, as above, so below. And so here we are, separated from each other, so that we can find each other in love, in order to create life anew, achieved by a divine union of opposing forces. Whether this be a baby being born through a loving union, or even a business, a home, a piece of music, created through the coming together of artists and companions in the sheer love of the craft, the message, the art. And of course, this is true for the universe as well. Divided into a spiraling and colliding cosmos of experience, life, death, and creation. Before, in strange aeons, it too finds itself back at its centre once more, coming back from whence it came, created anew, in a blinding light of all that is, divided for the chance of union. And all that has ever been and ever will be once again united in an endless cycle of love.